Good, but what the purpose is of today is sharing the ideas on the ISO 27000 MITs. When I was asked actually by Setula and the team to think of a topic on ISO 27001, I wanted to do a bit out of band, and it might be interesting actually to think about implementations and auditing, as Setulu also introduced. The reason for that one is I'm doing quite a few audits on a yearly basis as accredited auditor, but also guiding customers on implementing and helping them to comply with the ISO 27001. And there is in many cases lots of questions of these customers starting off with ISO 27001 for various reasons. In most of the cases, they're forced by customers by law to start implementing it, or by banks to guarantee actually a proper governance. Although that you must also know that certainly with the new laws that are coming up in Europe, and not only GDPR, but there is a law been agreed, like NIS, which is actually a law that requires actually critical companies with critical infrastructure, electricity, water provisioning, and so on, to comply with security standards. Lately, there has been the Cloud Security Act also in Europe, which is a small brother of the GDPR, but forcing or planning to certify also products, people, and services to make sure that actually there's a guarantee, basic guarantee of cybersecurity in the provision of services and products. And in this case, there's a lot of questions for company who gets confronted with ISO 27001 first. And what I did is pick a few of them, and there are more than 10, but I think that the most prominent ones are presented for today. What I will do is provide you with more links and some interesting links also in the LinkedIn group. So it's very nice to see that we can chat around after the session also and provide you with some more information. So I will provide also the links that I present today. A few discussions, a few screenshots will be presented also in articles on LinkedIn, so you can always come back and see the details or investigate yourself. The audience for today, I hope you all have a bit of a background on information security. It can be ISO 27000. If you have done some technical work or some management work within security, it's very helpful to understand, because ISO 27000, or ISMS in short acronym, is not only about hardware, not only about software, and I will explain during the session. So a bit of a background, even data protection officers with some GDPR or international legislation on privacy protection is quite helpful to understand what we're talking about for today. Cybersecurity basics of privacy, data protection. We will not talk too much about privacy and data protection, but you should realize that if you're forced or you need to implement a program to implement privacy protection or data protections like GDPR, but you can also do it on an international level, you can use ISO 27001, and I will explain also in a few things and a few references the new standard. So in 2019, now almost 2 years ago, there was a new standard launched within the ISO 27000 series that actually specifically focuses on GDPR and PII. So personal information protection. We will not focus on today, but it will pass a review. You can use it in many cases actually to explain what you need to do for these implementations, right? When you see the discussions about ISO 27001, and I might also refer to it as ISMS, you hear a lot of stories. And in many cases, yeah, it's not always clear what's the truth about it, and that's the goal of the session today. We'll understand the value of security management, and that's what ISMS is about. Make it consistent. How can it help your company, you and your company, actually to guarantee that your security is clear? And very important, I want to give you a few ideas, few tools, a few means to verify what others say. If you get some information and you don't trust it, or you don't not sure how to evaluate what other people say, if you see presentation on the internet, I will give you some hints and tips on to check on it and how to verify these tales, stories, or myths, whatever you want to call it. So the goal finally, of course, is to explain to you what are the real benefits of managed information security. And I hope actually to tell a bit of a story here to use these 10 myths to understand what you can do and how can you achieve actually information security on yourself, right? As mentioned, thanks for mentioning also my LinkedIn profile. If there's any questions, feel free to post it in the group, or specifically any questions. I've posted quite a few articles on this topic, so there might be some interesting links also to previous articles and web sessions. They're all posted on my profile via the article, so feel free. I will pop up later on at the end of the session the specific link for the articles, but feel free to have a check. Anyway, if there is any feedback, drop it in the chat. Setula and team are looking for the chats right now. As mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end of the talk. But feel free to drop any ideas or questions in the chat, and then we'll check later on. In worst case scenario, if we do not get to the list of questions at the end, we will make sure actually also the questions are published in the LinkedIn article, so you can always consult afterwards the answers. So I will take some time actually to make sure that all of them are answered in full detail. Pretty short agenda, although that if we want to run through these 10 minutes, we will probably need an hour. So hoping up to end up just after 11 o'clock here. So now it's 10 o'clock, and then I will also refer to a few additional items. As I mentioned, there are just 10. We only had an hour actually to present it. There are way more, and I think this is a great idea also for me to start off with a series of articles listing a bit more myths. You can find quite a lot of them on the internet if you start looking for it. And of course, I will provide you with some other means and key takeaways to debunk these myths and to have a critical look at it yourself. So I hope at least you will learn a bit from this session. First of all, before we dive into these top 10, where do these myths actually come from? In many cases, it takes quite a while to understand, and it takes quite some knowledge to understand what ISO is about, ISO 27001 or others, and exactly as Setulu mentioned also, if you haven't followed courses like lead implementer, lead auditor, or some introduction courses in risk management, it becomes all pretty dense in information. You see a lot of information popping up on the internet, but if you don't have a slight view on the vocabulary on what ISO 27000 or ISO 9000 is about, it's quite difficult to understand. And if people then start telling or making a story or doing some marketing on that one, you might notice that some of the stories are used to push commercial interest, and you might miss the link in this information. So that's exactly the point here. Also very important to do some research. If you see a statement you're not sure about, is go on the internet, ask a few experts, ask in the group. So that's a great interest also for the LinkedIn group. Ask for some additional explanation and try to find out the truth in a few things. There's always a second part, always as two sides in a story, and that's exactly one of the reasons that lots of these ISO 27000 myths exist, because yeah, they're not always contradicted or not always responded to, and that causes quite some harm actually on implementing the ISMS. To understand a bit more on the explanations I will give and to understand what we're talking about, first of all, what is ISMS? ISMS is Information Security Management System. It's referred to as the ISO 27001. It's a standard that actually discusses information security, but you should be aware that information security is not only technical, and you will see in the standard, if you look into it, that a part of that one is technology as what you can expect, but also very important information security is about people and processes. You need people to manage the hardware, and you need to explain to them how to manage the hardware. So the combination of people, process, and technology, sometimes referred to as PPP or PPT, is actually the combination you need of to implement information security. I will come back to that one because there's a new standard coming up, the ISO 27002, which is the implementation guidance for the 27001. It is being renewed. It is in draft mode right now, and it's very short to publication. So end of the year, end of this year, or beginning next year, there will be a new standard. And the new standard, the good news is, will be based on these categories of implementation. So have a look at it. I will quickly show you a few things outside the presentation today. So I might also quickly touch the new ISO 27002 standard. What you also should know is that ISO 27001 is actually built on top of the ISO 9001, which you should know from quality management. So the ISO 9000 is about handling processes in a measured way to allow actually to measurements to guarantee quality. And you might see it from a lot of commercial companies actually implementing 9000 to prove that their processes are effective and efficient in quality management. ISO 27001 adds a technical layer on top of that one, more specifically about the information security, and the consequence of that one is that you have 114 explicit controls that need to comply with if you want to certify. I will explain later on, because that has some consequences in how you look at this implementation. The good news is it will be slimmed down with the new version, so we will go, I think, up to 95 controls with the new version of the ISO 27002. So it might be again quite interesting to have a look at the new ISO 27002. Just to be clear, I mentioned already the 27701, which is actually privacy management. I mentioned the 2702, which is implementation guidance, but please be aware that the 27000 series is a set of standards. So it's built with a few principles, and I've named a few, but the list is way too long actually to put on a single slide. So you will also see the 2705, which we mentioned today, and the 2706. The 2705 is risk management, and is one of the core features also where the ISMS is built on. You must have a risk management system actually before you can certify for ISMS. 2706 is also quite important, and we will touch it later in one of the slides later on. It's the audit standards, and it explains how you should conduct an audit, or how you should calculate an audit. More importantly, there's a fixed schema in the 2706 that explains to auditors what is the time needed to audit the system, and certainly from a commercial point of view, what you pay for the audits is a very good standard that you can consult. But also on top of the audit standard, you will see that there is a ISO 27032, 35, the 17, the 18. So there are also technical standards for cloud security, information security. So there's a lot of things actually moving, and these are getting created. So for example, right now there's a huge focus also on privacy management. So you will see new standards popping up as on the way that we will look at. I will discuss a bit more later because there is a sort of life cycle linked to these ISO standards you should look at. So let's have a look at a few things. As I mentioned, ISO 9000 is actually the core standard, and one of the things you will find very explicitly, I will show you later on from the standard, is the principle of PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. And that actually means that, first of all, before you implement something, you need to plan. So the plan phase is quite important, to stand still, to think about what you're doing, and then start implementing. Also, the planning phase will make sure that you plan for metrics. You should measure your implementations, and that's not always clear, not always simple for technical implementations. So think about how can you evaluate your system, if it's working correct or not. And that's what actually happens in the third phase, in the check phase, where we will, during and after the implementation, we'll check if we get the goals we set up initially. And in the act phase, I would rather replace the word act into audit or into assess, because actually what happens is that the act phase is, first of all, we will check the implementation, we will check the metrics, and if there's a deviation, good or bad, whatever, then we will adapt the system. So act is audit, adapt, so you can better replace the word act to adapt, because some people make a confusion between act and do. And the last phase is very important, because that's the initiator for the next cycle. So once you start implementing the PDCA, you're actually on a running train, meaning that once the train is started, it will not stop. So the purpose actually of the ISO series is to keep improving. And once you start off with the ISO implementation, you should not stop and keep improving. The good news is, initial setup might be very hard, might require quite some resources, but on the run, and if you start improving with a few more cycles, you will notice actually that the effort to get better, and the next cycles will getting lighter and lighter. So the good news is, once started and keep the system running, you will get a lot more benefits after the first cycle. So we'll come back to that one, because lots of misinterpretations come from this PDCA, or the misunderstanding of the PDCA actually, right? You have seen also in the announcement for the courses, and that actually the base standard right now is ISO 27001 version 2013, and you will see lots of statement that actually it's old, it's dead. Why 2013? We're still in 2021. So this is the first myth that you will see, is that ISO 27001 version 2013 is dead. It's not relevant. What they actually mean with that one is it's not relevant for more 7 years or even 8 years of the history in that sense. Might undermine the validity of the ISO 27001, and people think, well, the version 2013 is way too old to implement. But first of all, you should know that an ISO standard typically has a 5-year cycle, more or less. So once published, there's in a few years time, there's a review cycle started. So for example, the ISO 9000 right now has been reviewed, and this is one of the examples where the standard has been confirmed. So the ISO 9000 this year has been confirmed as is. So the version number will stay. The good news for ISO 27000 is that there's an update coming up. So the 27002 is being updated, and what you know is that how ISO 27000 is built. We have first the clauses, the main topics, management clauses in the ISO 27001, and we have the annex, which actually are the list of controls to be implemented and to audited also. So this is the more or less the audit checklist and the implementation checklist. This will be updated very soon. So I can state here that actually ISO 27001 is very alive and kicking. So it's getting updated to current standards. It will also include some references to cloud security, cybersecurity, although that we have other standards that you can use to implement or complement the ISO 27001. Also, the structure, as I mentioned from the start, in the initial list, in the current versions, you will see in the annex that the topics are rather implemented on a functional level. There's HR security, there's network security, there's cryptography, there's legislation in their compliance in the different modules. What will happen in the new version is that actually it will get restructured. So the measures to be implemented will be categorized in 3 main categories: people, process, and technology. So technology is pretty clear what technical standards implementations you need to have to get compliant. But also process level is extremely important in ISO 27001 because we will touch all the processes within the company, and we need to implement documentation on that one. And in many cases, you can implement security on a process level. And one of the typical examples I provide also during my courses are, for example, USB sticks. Protecting USB sticks from data leakage, you can do it with encryption, but in many cases, it's way more easier, for example, to explain to people, well, be careful with USB sticks. You should not use them. You use a file sharing platform to send over your information and then try to eliminate the USB sticks. So in this case, for example, you don't always need technology to implement security. And of course, people are very important, are managing the security. They're responsible to that one. And as you know, in the current standards and in the current cyber situation is that a lot of cases, the people are the weakest point here. So for example, within cybersecurity, phishing is extremely important to have proper education and awareness training to educate these people. So we need to have these 3 main components within the implementation, and that's exactly what's going to happen with the new standard launching next, probably end of this year or beginning next year. So, right. Another one I can refer here is a new standard, as mentioned, the ISO 27701, which is also called PIMS, or the Privacy Information Management System. It's obvious and clear that actually the launch of the GDPR has been a driver to launch this standard, but also be aware that in follow-up of the GDPR, that also some international standards in Canada, in Brazil, Japan, other countries outside Europe have implemented additional security, additional privacy controls, and this is exactly where the ISO 27701 will provide you an answer to. Also, the ISO 29100 series, which is privacy management specifically, will provide you with some additional guidance on that one. They're pretty new. There's new stuff coming up very frequently to guide you with some practical standards. If you want to know more information about it, look for the ISO 29100 or the ISO 29184, for example. So you will see actually there's a lot of things moving here, and due to the changing international legislations, it's very likely that also these standards will be updated very soon to help you out actually on the implementation. So I hope with this one we debunked already myth number 1. In many cases, you will get also a feedback that ISO 27000 is just a mandatory list for compliance. So very important to know that, yeah, there are some checklists, there are some implementation checklists, but first of all, if you want to understand what this is about, you must first understand that compliance is not governance, and compliance means that you must comply, must fulfill some requirements. In many cases, it's about legislation. But also contracts, and for example, you will see in ISO 27001, there's an HR department, HR part of it. There's also vendor management into it, and so on. So lots of the references in ISO 27000 do refer to compliance, but in fact, ISO 27001 is actually about governance, is how do you manage your systems to comply with certain regulations. So it gives you some advice on how to do it. So it's not a checklist as in a regulation, as in a GDPR. So be aware there's a slight difference between compliance and governance. And ISO 27000 is best practice about governance. We do need to take care of compliance, but the guarantee to be compliant actually is the audit part or the check part that you will see. So inspections, audits, and so on will make sure that that you can guarantee or prove that you're compliant with these implementations. Right? And as I mentioned, the ISO is rather a best practice, so it's not complete. It might not be always fit for you, or you need to pick a few of these standards that apply to your situation. But the ISO standards are actually a group of communities and people working together to define what they would or should implement actually to get the best out of it. In this case, we focus on information security, but as you know, there are other standards for other sectors, also within production, within other areas, you might find a few situations. Just give me a second here. One of the areas that you should look at also for the best practices, I mentioned over here, is 27017, 18, 19 is cloud and cybersecurity, which is very important actually for implementations. And what we will cover later on is you can also implement and complement these best practices with other frameworks. But I will take it that story actually with on of the other myths here. But be aware that there's a lot of information there. Have a look at the list of standards, and the practical part of that one is if you think, or if you want to implement certain areas of security, incident management, disaster recovery, cloud security, you can look actually at more standards and find out some other guidance on that one. Of course, you can complement it with more technical guidance also from vendors, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, or specific infrastructure providers in that sense. Good. So be aware that there are more standards. Just to be clear, on the level of audits, there's only two. I also mentioned here the 27701. There are actually two standards with the one at the last number, the ISO 27001 and the 27701 that are auditable. So these have requirements, and these can be used actually as an audit. Of course, during implementation, you can complement these standards with additional requirements, but that's up to you to certify in that sense. Right. Due to the fact that we have that checklist, we have the compliance requirements, and we have this implementation, is one of the typical answers or typical feedback that you might get, or critics, depending on who you're talking to, is that the ISO 27001 is a paper mammoth, meaning a big paper beast, actually providing only extra administration, is not adding value to the implementation, but due to the fact that there are some strict categories in the ISO implementation, it's not fit for your organization. So one of the critics here is it's just paperwork to get with the checklist I discussed in the previous myth. In that sense, not flexible, not customized to fit your company, but you should not look at it as I mentioned before, as a checklist, because it provides you actually with some guidances to implementation. And first of all, these are general guidelines, not specifically technical. But actually, ISO does not mandate how to implement the technical standards. So it's a general framework. It gives you actually an idea of what to implement to make sure that you cover all areas, and you can complement these implementations or requirements that are set out in the ISO 27001 with technical controls. And the most famous ones, certainly in current situation, are, for example, the sys controls. The sys controls actually is a list of technical best practices, very technical, and in most of the cases also highlighted for specific environments, for specific functions in your technical environment. The other one is the NIST. The NIST with a T, NIST, is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is purely an American-based or government-based organization that provides guidance for American organizations. The advantage of the NIST guidelines in most of the cases is it's highly technical, highly detailed. For example, the counterpart of the ISO implementation, ISO 27001, which is the NIST guide 800-53, has more or less 480, 490 pages on technical implementation. So if you need to dig into that one, it will take quite some time to understand what's in there. On the other hand, it's a perfect companion actually to implement the required implementations that are set up in the ISO 27001. I also mentioned ENISA here because ENISA is the cybersecurity organization on Europe level, and actually it's quite fresh, very young, but it has quite some interesting guidance on European level to implement cybersecurity measures, and you can easily find the ENISA websites with some very interesting guidances how to secure your environment from a level of security, right? I mentioned a few other ones, CNIL or the ICO, ICO. CNIL is the data protection organization in France, the central authority, and the ICO is the data protection authority in the UK. They have been both quite impressive leaders actually on providing information and documentation how to implement technical data protection. So you might refer to them also in add-ons for adding data protection measures within your ISMS system or implementing the GDPR, for example. And lots of these implementation will help you actually to implement the information security. Be aware that you do not have any data protection without cybersecurity. It's extremely important to think about cyber to protect your data, personal data. Because of that, yeah, one of the other typical feedback you will get is that ISO 27001 does not work with NIST sys. And as I mentioned also in the previous slides, the ISO 27001 is actually a very high level framework, and many people think that if they dive into the standard that they must stick to that standard. They cannot look at other options or complemented with additional implementation. So they put ISO 27001 versus NIST versus CIS or versus ISACA COBIT. So they put it in opposite directions, and actually what if you look at it, you will find out that there is a lot of comparison material with the syscontrol NIST as what I explained previously. And for example, for the syscontrols, you can easily find a comparison guide with the ISO 27000 series. A very typical difference between the ISO 27001 and the syscontrols is that the syscontrol is highly technical, so more or less aligned with the annex of the ISO 27001, but less within the management sphere, meaning that they less focus on management processes. And that's exactly where you can combine the ISO 27001 with the NIST guidelines, for example, or ISACA, COBIT, or the syscontrol. So there's a lot of information that you can actually combine to them. Myth number 5. Information security is for the IT guys, and mainly what they mean is let's do the IT implementation. Let's make sure that IT guys take care of the ISO implementation, and it's done. What you will see is that in many cases they only look at the annex. There's of course a lot of technical implementations in there, but the ISO is actually not focused on the IT implementation only. So there's a huge difference between IT, information technology, versus information security. And what you will see actually that the ISO 27001 is actually built from the business level implementations. So you will see a few layers in the implementation if you look through it, and strategical, tactical, and operational implementations is very important to understand actually when implementing ISO 27001. Let me quickly show you also, if I stop the presentation and look at the ISO the table of contents, and you see actually at the first level of implementation, chapter number 4 and 5 is about context of the organization and leadership. And what actually is meant here is that you will see that the implementation of ISO 27001 starts on business level. You must understand the business. What is the business about? What do you need to protect? Make a list of it, which is the asset inventory. And very important, part number 2, chapter 5, will actually motivate the leadership and have their commitment to implement security. In essence, you ask their support, and you ask for a budget, you ask for time, you ask for experience, and to make sure the leadership is aware of it. You must have their commitment. You will also see at the end of the PDCA cycle, we will feed back all the implementation information back to the leadership with some approval. So you will see that actually the implementation of ISO 27001 is actually by nature not technical. So it's quite important actually to understand that everyone in the company is involved in the implementation. This also means that in many cases, ISO implementation will hit or will impact a lot of other departments than IT, and that means also that you will need the support of these business people to start implementing the controls. So we will again focus on PPT during the implementation of ISO 27001, people, process, and technology. So yeah, it's very easy to explain simply by showing off what's in the ISO standard, and you will easily be able to explain actually that actually it's not only IT. And very important, the most of the IT people are willing to fix it, but they should not take control of the situation. They're part of the team, they're part of the implementation, but they're certainly not fully responsible for the implementation of ISO 27001, which is certainly for accountability and responsibility a major issue, because if it goes wrong, it's actually not the fault, not always the fault of the IT system. So we should talk to management actually to fix a few things. Myth number 6, probably yeah, one of the myths that actually we heard a lot is also, once you have set up your ISMS system, once you have fixed your security, it's done, right? So let's do the checklist, make sure it's certified, and then we can do something else. But it's not the case, because actually what we explained already in one of the first slides, the whole cycle, the whole ISO is built on plan, do, check, act. Is plan first, execute, check what you're doing, and act again on the things that are needed to be updated. So adapt actually to be correct, which means also that these implementations run in cycles. Can be a big cycle, can be a small cycle, but actually the purpose actually of end of the cycle is to evaluate where you are. Did you do your job? Is there something you would improve? If yes, okay, then we will move to the next level. We will start increasing the security. Or no, there's a problem, then we need to fix it. So once you get started with the systems, of course you can stop it, but then you lose a complete value of your ISO implementation, and very typically also during the implementation and during audit cycles, you will notice that actually you need to keep running the systems, and this is a very typical mistake in implementing your information security, right? There's a second thing you should be aware of, is actually the certification of your ISMS is also bound to a life cycle. So not only the processes need to be kept up to date, but also your certificate is only valid for 3 years at initial certification. So that does not mean that you're quite actually for 3 years. On the contrary, the ISO system, and more specifically the ISO 27006, demands that actually you do an update, or and actually it's the auditor that needs to come by every year for a maintenance. What will happen in year one? You will have a maintenance audit, which is more or less 1/3 of the audit time that you will spend in year one and year two. But year three, your certificate will expire. So what happens at year three? You will have a recertification audit. So that's that expiration mechanisms of your certification will push you also to keep up to date, and the audit system will make sure actually that you also keep improving, and it's very important actually that the life cycle is maintained within the system. So this should debunk the myth actually that a one-time implementation is sufficient to keep your ISO 27001 certificate, right? Myth number 7, very important. Lots of companies that think, well, we want to start with ISMS or ISO 27001 implementation. We must be mature and it must be perfect to 100% before we can certify. And it's like running a marathon. You need to prepare, and you can only finish or you cannot finish, but actually that is not quite correct within the ISO interpretation, because there are some minimal standards that you should have in your ISMS implementation. So we have these minimum controls, but the whole system is actually built on continuous improvement. And for that one, I would like to explain a bit on CMMI, Capability Maturity Index, or Capability Maturity Indication. Actually, that explains that once you get started, you can start with some minimal implementations and then start improving it within a cycle. So in many cases, the initial certification or the initial implementation is a manual process, and then over time you will see that actually that the system gets automated. You get metrics, and in many cases companies will evolve into automated systems, yes or no, supported by software systems. So there's no requirement actually to implement a certain software to get started with ISMS. I think you have seen the CMMI before. Just for your information, CMMI is now managed by the CMMI Institute, which is a sort of subsidiary from ISACA. But initially, the CMMI index with a number from 1 to 5 was used within software development to see how mature software coding was. But you can actually extend that appreciation or evaluation for maturity also to information security. And you can interpret actually this level quite simple, meaning level 1 is no implementation, no structured implementations. You start handling an issue when it's popping up, but you don't have any means to predict or to structurally handle these issues. In level 2, the knowledge is at least shared, so some of the processes are documented. Very typically, level 1, there's one person in the company who knows what to do, but if he's on leave or sick, you will see that some of the processes are not executed anymore. In level 2, the knowledge is partially shared. You have a team of people working on a few items or functionalities, and you can actually hand over a few of the tasks. But in worst case scenario, if something goes terribly wrong, you do not have a structured documentation. There is no prediction and predictability in the systems. So level 1 and 2 are reactive phases. Within level 3, we start acting proactively and providing documentation, making sure that the processes are documented and that we can actually share knowledge and actually hand over some process. And then you understand also that level 3 is more or less the target level that you should have for the certification of your ISMS system. In level 4, we are starting using metrics. I explained already in the past within the planning of the PDCA that you should think about metrics. How do you measure your system? That is being actively used in level 4. By the way, the CMI index is quantified or actually applied on functional level, on process level, not on the entire systems, because some of the functions can be less evaluated, less mature than other ones, and you can make an explicit choice, for example, to focus on certain systems to make them more mature than other ones. Level 5 means that you're actually using these metrics to improve your system automatically, meaning you get feedback, you start planning for improvement. Actually, you ask approval for the management. Actually, in the process, you can start using actually this in level 5 actually to start improving your systems almost automatically. And of course, within the technical systems, you could start using software to automate tasks, to register incidents, to improve incidents, to make notifications and so on. So this is typically level 5. But again, process level, not on company level, and it's up to you to decide to what level you want to implement. And there is no requirement to work at level 5, right? So essentially, basically level 3 is okay. Of course, the improvement systems of PDCA will push you to do better over time. And what I see from practice that in most of the cases, companies take 3 years, so the initial cycle for certification, to get the basic system up and running, to get it mature, and then the next cycle, meaning that the year 4, 5, and 6, they start improving the systems, making more consistent implementations of platforms to guarantee the growth to level 4 and then level 5, right? Myth number 8 is pretty much the same. Get the damn ISMS software and it's done. Well, as I explained, in many cases, people think if we buy the software, we're compliant. This kind of thought actually comes from the same level of that get some GDPR software and we're compliant, right? So the software will do it. As I mentioned before, it's not as simple. It's a management system. We are talking also about peoples and processes. Of course, with a decent and a mature platform, you can help implementing ISO 27001, but on the contradiction, actually, and the opposite, it's usually implementing a 27001 system from scratch is usually done without a fancy software, without expensive software. You can perfectly do it with some basic documentation and Excel sheets. Of course, depending on the size of your organization, but mostly the software implementation or improving your systems using automated systems, cloud systems, actually comes later in the cycle. First, make sure that you implement the metrics, implement the annex, implement the clauses, and in many cases, certainly within the clauses, it's not about the software, it's rather about the people and the process and making sure that you get consistent results, right? So ISMS implementation by default is not the software, but starts with the internal ISMS implementation, right? Another point, and I will advance later on also into cybersecurity and cloud security. In many cases, people understand information security IS from ISMS as only about security. Many companies will focus on getting higher security only, and that's a wrong interpretation, because you do not get the best of the benefits of ISMS implementation. As you will see, is as we mentioned, it's all about improving the processes, but more important is having consistent processes, having optimized processes, and getting that process approach within your company will actually bring less expensive, because you're consolidating, standardizing processes, do the same way, and you will also see that actually by consolidating and having consistent processes, it will get less expensive, more efficient, and actually the results will get better. And very important also, what you see right now due to demand also in compliance, is that having that ISO certification will give you a better reputation, because people know that implementing an ISO implementations will structure the process, will of course protect the information, but be aware that also ISO implementation, not only for 27001, for ISO 9000 is exactly the same, will have a strong reputation boost. And do not hesitate actually to show to your customers and to show to your market actually that you're implementing ISO. So it's certainly from a business approach, a very strong marketing point. Although that the focus is, of course, on implementing information security, you can apply exactly the same also for your data protection. So starting off with ISO 27001 is in most cases also a very strong boost. And there are a few other items I forgot to mention over here, but also compliance, making sure that you get less complaints. For example, if there's a complaint with your data protection authority, you have the processes in place actually to show them what you do and what you did not do in many cases. So it will help you also defend yourself. So also from a legal point of view, ISO implementation is very strong and very helpful actually to prove that you did not do anything wrong or you did do specific things, because actually the ISMS system is all about evidence, right? So making sure that you document your system, make sure you document your actions, that will help you actually to make a consistent system. So it's more than security only, and in that case, right? And that brings me more or less to myth number 10. With an ISMS system, you're 100% secure. Well, or you see it the other way around, is the people that are opposite to ISMS implementation will tell you, well, even if you implement an ISMS system, you're not 100% sure. And what's the truth about this? Well, people implementing ISMS or ISO 27001 still can get hacked. It's like car security. You can have the best protection in your car with new technology, with cameras, with advanced security. Still, we're working with people, we're working with software, so there are still some possibilities that actually your system gets hacked. On the other hand, by implementing ISO 27001, you still can make sure that the hacker actually doesn't get away as simple as getting into the system and destroying your systems. And due to that implementation, what you will see is that it's not about protecting against hacking. Of course, some of the implementations will provide you with some additional impact, or actually less impact into the system. It's not about keeping the hacker out, but actually minimizing the impact of the hacker. So yes, you will make the life very difficult for the hacker to get in with the managed security. You have a plan. You also have a layered security, so you will provide security in multiple layers within your company, so the hacker will not get in easily. And very important, you know how to react to a hacker. So if there's a ransomware, if there's, for example, a DDoS, a denial of service attack, or someone damages your systems, you have a plan to react on that one. The point here is that with that plan, you can avoid panic, because you predict what can happen, you know how to handle, and it's very important that in the case of panic, actually you have a checklist, you know what to do, you know what to call to about that one. But most importantly, implementing information security in a structured way actually will limit the damage. So instead of having no protection against the hacker once he gets in, the ISO system will allow you actually to have backup, have incident response, have disaster recovery, or alternative means actually to provide some additional security into your systems. And more important, you can recover rapidly. Be also aware that the continuous improvement phase of your ISO implementation will require you to keep aware of what is happening in the outside world, to be aware what kind of hacking can happen to you. So it's quite important also to keep up to date with the current threats, and that is what is risk management about. So we will not cover in detail the risk management today, but one of the key basic implementations to start off with ISMS and ISO implementations is risk management. Is what is threatening you, what is the current situation, and due to the PDCA, Plan to Check Act cycle, you will be forced actually to at least once a year reevaluate the situation, and that should include also, of course, hacking and crime into certain situations. So can you avoid it 100%? No, absolutely not. Hackers will always outsmart you. They will be always faster and smarter than the current security. The main reason for that one is hackers do not need to respect the law, right? So they can do some illegal action, they can be unethical and a few things, and that's the difficulty as a company. You need to be very aware what are the boundaries actually for your implementation, but by building some layered security can make the life of a hacker quite difficult and to protect yourself quite easily, right? To close off the session for today, it's quite important to understand there's a big difference between best practices, which is the ISO implementation, and regulation, which is the law, but also contracts. So the ISO implementation is a flexible framework that you can choose to implement, and you can choose to choose the methods of what you want to do. So there's no obligation within the ISO implementation to choose specific parameters or specific platforms. It's up to you to do so. Also very important, like the GDPR, the implementation of the ISMS is about responsibility and accountability. Responsibility means who executes the security, who is taking care of the security. Accountability is actually who's paying the bill for it. And what I showed you also from the beginning of the session, accountability is clearly pointed at the management. And that's very important to know how to implement ISO implementations. Make management responsible for the actions, make sure that you get the sponsoring from it, not only from a financial point of view, but make sure that you get the support also in communications and in experience in the people management and so on. So it's quite important to do so, right? Just as a reminder, regulation and legal is a must do, so you can't avoid that one. That's the law. So also in contracts, for example, you must respect what has been agreed. While in best practice, you have a way more flexibility in to do so. It can be implemented. It's not always a must do, but also there's also a difference between best practice and minimal implementation. So what we aim for in the ISO implementation is to do better and make sure that you improve your systems over time. So actually it supports you to do better over time and to grow the systems in many cases, right? One last thing before we go into the Q&A is also be aware of the supply chain. There's a specific mention within the Annex 15, which is vendor management and partner management, certainly within cloud and security. And we have seen it all over the place also within GDPR is supply chain. What is supply chain? Is that some of the tasks you are accountable or responsible for are executed by third parties, right? So that can be consultants, can be providers, can be partners that are taking care of a few of the actions actually that you are responsible for. So it's extremely important in this case to make sure that you cover these responsibilities yourself by subcontracting and contracts, because, for example, in GDPR, there's the data controller and the data processor relation. So you must make sure actually they execute it like you wish, like you decided to do so. And that certainly within cloud and cybersecurity and internet, it's not always easy to maintain that control, because in many cases you lose physical control. And that needs to be covered by not only contract, but also by audit, by monitoring and so on. So make sure that you protect yourself sufficiently. And so this means that also third-party contracting is getting more and more important. So just a little warning here, spend enough time actually into that supply chain and make sure that you have sufficient NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, or SLA, service level agreements, and penalties. So if something goes wrong, that actually you can ask a refund or actually claim the damage with your contractors, right?